They called him heartless, ruthless, cold, until the night he arrived soaked in blood, begging them to save a dying child. The emergency room doors burst open at 2:47 a.m., and every head turned. Alexander Kane, the Alexander Kane, CEO of Kane Industries and the city's most feared businessman, stood in the doorway, his $3,000 suit soaked in blood. But it wasn't his blood. Cradled in his arms was a small girl, no more than 7 years old, her face pale as moonlight and her breathing shallow. The nurses froze, their clipboards hanging midair. Even Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who'd seen everything in her 15 years at County General, felt her heart skip a beat. This was the man who tried to shut down their hospital just 3 months ago, calling it financially inefficient at a board meeting. Now he was here, desperation carved into every line of his usually stoic face. "Help her," he commanded, his voice cracking on the second word. "Please." The automatic doors closed behind him with a soft whoosh, and for a moment, the entire emergency room seemed suspended in time. Kane's normally immaculate appearance was completely shattered. His dark hair, usually slicked back perfectly, hung wet and disheveled across his forehead. Rain dripped from his designer clothes onto the sterile white floor, creating small crimson puddles that mixed with water. His Italian leather shoes squeaked against the linoleum as he took an uncertain step forward, and that's when everyone noticed something else. The great Alexander Kane, the man who'd fired 300 employees without blinking, had tears streaming down his face. The child in his arms was limp, her small body seeming even tinier against his tall frame. Her blonde hair was matted with dirt and rain, tangled in knots that spoke of days without care. One of her small hands dangled limply, revealing fingernails caked with grime and what looked like dry blood. The tattered pink dress she wore was several sizes too small, torn at the hem and missing buttons. Her bare feet were covered in cuts and bruises, the kind that came from walking on city streets without shoes. Young nurse Jennifer Chun was the first to break the spell. She dropped her coffee cup, not even noticing as it shattered on the floor, and rushed to grab a gurney. The sound of the ceramic breaking seemed to snap everyone else back to reality. Dr. Mitchell sprinted forward, her stethoscope swinging wildly around her neck. 2 more nurses materialized from the triage area, their faces shifting from shock to professional focus in an instant. "Trauma room 3 now," Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos that erupted. Somewhere in the background, a phone started ringing insistently. A family in the waiting area stood up, craning their necks to see what the commotion was about. The security guard near the entrance grabbed his radio, unsure whether this situation required backup or not. Kane moved toward the gurney, but his legs seemed unsteady. He stumbled slightly, and orderly Marcus Johnson rushed to steady him, gripping his elbow. "Sir, let us take her," Marcus said gently, reaching for the child. But Kane's arms tightened instinctively around the little girl, as if releasing her might mean losing her forever. "Mr. Kane," Dr. Mitchell said firmly, positioning herself directly in front of him and meeting his wild eyes. "We need to help her right now. You need to let her go." For a brief second, Kane looked like he might refuse. His jaw clenched, his red-rimmed eyes searched the doctor's face, looking for something, trust, perhaps, or a guarantee that couldn't be given. Then, slowly, almost painfully, he lowered the child onto the gurney. His hands lingered on her small shoulders for just a moment longer before he pulled away. As the medical team began rushing the gurney down the corridor, Kane tried to follow, his expensive shoes leaving wet prints on the floor. A younger resident stepped in front of him, raising a hand to stop him, but Dr. Mitchell called back without turning around. "Let him come." Sarah snapped into action, directing Kane to Trauma Room 3. As her team swarmed the child, hooking up monitors and starting IVs, she noticed something odd. The girl wore a tattered dress that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. Her arms were covered in bruises, some fresh, some healing. This wasn't Kane's daughter. Everyone knew he had no children. His late wife had passed away 5 years ago, and he'd become even more isolated since then. "Who is she?" Sarah demanded, checking the girl's vitals. The numbers were bad. Really bad. Kane stood in the corner, looking more vulnerable than anyone had ever seen him. "I found her in an alley behind my office building. She was lying in the rain, barely conscious. I didn't know where else to go." "Why didn't you call an ambulance?" asked Nurse Jennifer, unable to hide her suspicion. "I did," Kane shot back. "They said it would take 20 minutes. She didn't have 20 minutes. His hands were shaking, hands that had signed billion-dollar deals without trembling once. The monitors erupted in a chorus of beeps and alarms. Jennifer moved swiftly, adjusting the oxygen mask over the child's face while another nurse, Tom Rodriguez, worked to establish a second-floor line. The girl's blood pressure was dangerously low, her body temperature registering at a life-threatening 89 degrees. Sarah's mind raced through protocols, calculating medications and interventions while her hands moved with practiced precision. "Get me warming blankets, heated saline, and call the blood bank," Sarah ordered, her eyes never leaving the monitor screens. "And someone page Dr. Chun for pediatrics. Tell him it's urgent." She turned to Kane, her expression hard. "How long was she out there?" "In the alley." Kane's face went even paler. "I don't know. I was working late, left around midnight. She wasn't there when I arrived at 6 yesterday evening." "But," he ran a hand through his wet hair, his voice dropping, "there was a homeless man nearby. He said he'd seen her collapse around 11, that she'd been wandering the streets for hours before that, stumbling, calling out for someone." "Calling out for who?" Sarah asked sharply, checking the girl's pupils with a penlight. One was slightly more dilated than the other, a concerning sign. "Her mother," Kane whispered. "She kept saying, 'Mama, where are you?' over and over until she just fell." Jennifer exchanged a loaded glance with Tom. They both knew what those bruises likely meant, what that level of neglect suggested. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something darker, something that would require calls to police and social services. But right now, the only thing that mattered was keeping her alive. The trauma room door swung open, and Dr. Richard Chun rushed in, still tying his surgical mask. He took one look at the monitors and immediately began his assessment. "Possible head trauma," he muttered, gently palpating the girl's skull. "There's swelling here, behind the left ear. She needs a CT scan as soon as she's stable enough to transport." Kane pushed off from the wall where he'd been leaning. "Is she going to make it?" The question came out strangled, desperate. This wasn't the commanding voice that had reduced grown men to silence in boardrooms. This was a man confronting something money and power couldn't fix. Sarah met his eyes briefly. "We're doing everything we can, but I need more information. Does she have any identification? Anything in her pockets?" "Nothing," Kane said, reaching into his own jacket pocket and pulling out a small, filthy stuffed rabbit, its ear torn and hanging by threads. "Just this. She was clutching it when I found her." I had to. I had to pry her fingers open to check for a pulse. His voice broke slightly. She held on so tight, even unconscious, like it was the only thing she had left in the world. Jennifer took the toy carefully, setting it on the counter nearby. The simple gesture seemed to ground Kane somehow. He stepped closer to the bed, watching as the medical team worked with coordinated efficiency. Warm fluids flowed through the IVs. Heated blankets were layered over the small body. Medications were pushed, doses calculated based on estimated weight, since there was no way to properly weigh her in this condition. Her heart rate is coming up, Tom announced, a note of cautious optimism in his voice. 92 beats per minute. Temperature's rising too, Jennifer added. 91.3. Sarah allowed herself a small breath of relief, though they weren't out of danger yet. She turned back to Kane, her voice softer now, but still probing. You said you found her behind your building. The Kane Industries Tower is in the financial district. What was a child doing there alone at midnight? Kane's jaw tightened. That's what I keep asking myself. That area, it's all offices and high-rises. There's a soup kitchen 6 blocks away, a shelter for families another 4 blocks beyond that. But nothing for streets like that. Nothing that would explain. He trailed off, looking at the small, battered body on the gurney. When I saw her lying there in the rain, she looked so small, so broken. I couldn't just leave her. I couldn't be another person who walked past and pretended not to see. The next hour was chaos. The girl had hypothermia, severe malnutrition, and internal bleeding from what looked like a recent beating. Sarah worked with fierce concentration, barking orders while her mind raced. Meanwhile, Kane refused to leave the trauma room. Security tried to remove him twice, but Sarah waved them off. Something about his presence seemed important, though she couldn't explain why. Talk to her, Sarah instructed Kane during a critical moment when the girl's heart rate dropped dangerously low. Sometimes they can hear us. Kane approached the bed hesitantly. This man who commanded boardrooms and crushed competitors looked lost. He took the small hand in his. Hey there, fighter. I'm Alexander. You're gonna be okay. I promise you're safe now. His voice was gentle, almost unrecognizable. Whatever happened before, it's over. You're not alone anymore. The monitor beeped steadily. The girl's vitals stabilized, just slightly, but enough. Sarah caught Kane's eye and nodded. But the reprieve was temporary. Dr. Chun returned from reviewing the CT scan images, his face grim. He pulled Sarah aside near the medication cart, speaking in low tones that Kane strained to hear. There's subdural bleeding, but it's minor. What concerns me more is the pattern of old fractures. Her left arm was broken at least twice and never properly set. 3 ribs show signs of previous trauma. This child has been systematically abused for months, maybe longer. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. In 15 years, she'd never gotten used to cases like this. She glanced back at Kane, who was still standing by the bedside, his thumb absently rubbing circles on the back of the girl's small hand. It was such a tender gesture, so at odds with everything she knew about the ruthless businessman. I've already called Child Protective Services, Dr. Chin continued, and the police will need to be notified. When she wakes up, if she wakes up, we'll need to document everything. Take photographs, get her statement. He paused, watching Kane. Do we know anything more about him? Why he was really there? Sarah shook her head. His story checks out so far. I had Jennifer call the dispatch center. They confirmed he did call for an ambulance at 12:13 a.m. The recording has him screaming at them to hurry. She crossed her arms. Whatever else Alexander Kane might be, He saved this child's life tonight. Without him, she'd be dead in that alley. A sudden alarm cut through their conversation. The girl's oxygen saturation was dropping rapidly. Sarah rushed back, adjusting the oxygen flow while Jennifer prepared emergency intubation equipment just in case. Kane stepped back, giving them room, but his eyes never left the child's face. His expensive suit was now completely ruined, stiff with dried blood and wrinkled from the damp, but he didn't seem to notice or care. "Come on, sweetheart," Sarah murmured, checking the girl's airway. "Stay with us. Just a little longer." She made a split-second decision, administering a medication that would help open the airways. 30 seconds passed like 30 hours. Then the oxygen levels began climbing again. 92%, 94, 97. Tom let out a breath he'd been holding. That was close. Too close, Sarah agreed, making notes on the chart. She looked up to find Kane leaning against the wall, one hand pressed against his chest, as if his own heart was struggling. The man looked absolutely wrecked, emotionally and physically drained in a way that seemed completely foreign to someone of his stature. "Mr. Kane," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension. "When was the last time you ate or drank anything?" He blinked at her, seeming confused by the question. I don't know. Lunch yesterday, maybe? There was a board meeting that ran late, and then I had contracts to review." He waved a hand dismissively. "It doesn't matter. It matters if you collapse in my trauma room," Sarah countered. "Jennifer, get him some juice and a sandwich from the break room." When Kane started to protest, she cut him off. "That's not a request. You're no good to her if you pass out." Jennifer hurried out, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the room, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft hiss of oxygen. Kane moved back toward the bedside, drawn like a magnet. He stared down at the girl's face, now slightly pink with improved circulation instead of that deathly pale. "She has freckles," he said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't notice before, in the rain and dark. She has freckles across her nose, just like—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw working as he fought for control. "Just like who?" Sarah asked gently, moving to stand beside him. Kane's shoulders sagged. "My wife, Catherine. She had the same pattern of freckles." He laughed bitterly. "We used to talk about having children. She wanted a daughter. We tried for years, but it never happened. The doctor said it was unlikely, and then the cancer came, and—" His voice trailed off into painful silence. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of the man before her. This wasn't just a random act of heroism. This was a broken man seeing a second chance, whether he fully realized it yet or not. At dawn, with the girl finally stable and sleeping, Kane sat in the waiting room. Sarah brought him coffee and sat down beside him. The rest of the hospital staff watched from a distance, whispering theories. "I owe you an explanation," Kane began, staring at the paper cup in his hands. 6 months ago, my wife died of cancer. Before she passed, she made me promise something. She said I'd become cold, that I'd forgotten what it meant to be human. She asked me to remember that money isn't everything, that every life matters. He paused, his jaw tight. "Tonight, I was leaving the office late. I saw that child lying there, and everyone just walked past her. A dozen people saw her and did nothing." Sarah remained quiet, letting him continue. "I couldn't be another person who walked away. My wife would have stopped, so I did." He looked up, his eyes red. "I know I tried to close this hospital. I thought I was making a smart business decision. I was wrong. You people save lives. You saved hers tonight." The coffee in Kane's hands had gone cold, but he still gripped the cup like it was an anchor. Outside the waiting room windows, the sky was turning from black to deep purple, the first hints of sunrise painting the clouds. The hospital was shifting from its night rhythm to day, nurses changing shifts, breakfast carts rattling down hallways, the building slowly coming back to life. Catherine was admitted to this hospital. Kane continued, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years ago, when we first got her diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The oncologist gave her 6 months. He finally took a sip of the coffee, grimacing at the cold bitterness, but drinking it anyway. She lived for 2.5 years. Do you know why? Sarah shook her head, watching his profile as the growing light from the windows cast shadows across his exhausted face. Because of a nurse in the oncology ward, Maria Gonzalez. She wasn't even assigned to Catherine's case, but she saw my wife crying alone in the corridor one day and sat with her for 3 hours. Just sat there, held her hand, let her talk about her fears. Kane's voice cracked. Maria came in on her days off to check on Catherine. She brought her homemade soup when the chemo made everything taste like metal. She braided her hair when Catherine was too weak to lift her arms. She was there at the end, holding Catherine's other hand while I held the first. A young resident walked past, staring openly at Kane before Sarah shot her a look that sent her scurrying away. The waiting room was slowly filling with the morning's early arrivals. A woman with a coughing child, an elderly man clutching his chest, the normal parade of human suffering that hospitals collected. After Catherine died, I fired Maria, Kane said flatly, and Sarah's head snapped toward him in shock. Not directly. I reviewed the hospital's financials, saw they were struggling, and, as majority shareholder, I demanded cuts. I presented a restructuring plan that eliminated 50 nursing positions. Maria was one of them. He set down a coffee cup with shaking hands. I told myself it was just business, that the hospital needed to be profitable to survive, that 50 jobs lost now would save the institution and protect hundreds more positions long term. That's partially true, Sarah said carefully. The hospital was drowning in debt. It was true, Kane agreed, but it was also cowardice. I couldn't bear to see this place anymore. Couldn't walk these halls without seeing Catherine in every room. So I tried to destroy it instead, called it fiscal responsibility, when really it was just pain I didn't know how to handle. He turned to look at Sarah directly. Maria Gonzalez came to my office after she was let go. She didn't yell or curse me. She just asked me one question. Would Mrs. Kane be proud of who you've become? Then she left. Sarah felt a lump forming in her throat. Around them, the hospital continued its eternal rhythm, but in this small bubble of space, there was only Kane's confession and the weight of his regret. I've spent 6 months trying to answer that question, Kane continued. I threw myself into work, made more money, closed more deals, fired more people who weren't performing at peak efficiency. I convinced myself that's what success looked like. That's what being strong meant. He laughed bitterly. Then tonight, I saw that little girl, and I heard Catherine's voice in my head as clear as if she were standing next to me. She said, "Help her, Alex. Please help her." So I did. A phone rang somewhere at the nurse's station, and they both heard someone answering it, discussing lab results and medication orders. Life moved on, indifferent to their conversation. When I picked her up from that alley, she weighed nothing, Kane said, his eyes distant, like holding air. And I thought about all the spreadsheets I'd reviewed, all the budget cuts I'd approved, all the inefficiencies I'd eliminated. But I couldn't find a formula to calculate what a child's life is worth. Couldn't put a price on the second chance I was begging you to give her. He met Sarah's eyes again. I understand now. What Catherine meant. What Maria was trying to tell me. Some things can't be measured in profit margins. Sarah reached over and squeezed his shoulder. She's going to make it, Mr. Kane. The girl. She's strong. Stronger than she should be given what she's endured. Does she have a name yet? Kane asked. From the police or social services? Not yet, Sarah replied. They're running her fingerprints, checking missing persons reports. Someone will be looking for her. Kane's expression darkened. Someone was hurting her. Those bruises, those old fractures, that wasn't an accident. Whoever's looking for her, they shouldn't find her. She deserves better than whatever hell she escaped from. 2 weeks later, Kane stood before the hospital board with a very different proposal. He pledged $20 million to expand the emergency department and fund a program for homeless children. The girl, who they learned was named Emma, had been living on the streets for months after running from an abusive foster home. Kane had already started the legal process to become her guardian. On the day Emma was discharged, she held Kane's hand tightly as they walked through the hospital. Sarah met them at the exit. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, Kane said, and this time his voice held warmth. For saving her. For giving me a chance to be better. Emma looked up at him and smiled. The first real smile anyone had seen from her. Can we go home now, Alexander? Yes, he whispered, his own eyes bright. Let's go home. As they disappeared through those same emergency doors, Sarah smiled. Sometimes the coldest hearts just needed the right reason to thaw. And sometimes, one small life could change everything. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. In those 2 weeks, Kane had practically lived at the hospital, arriving each morning before visiting hours officially began and staying until security gently reminded him it was time to leave. He'd read to Emma from books he'd had rushed delivered from the city's best bookstore, fairy tales and adventure stories that made her giggle despite the pain. He'd learned to braid her hair from YouTube videos, his large hands fumbling at first, but growing more confident with each attempt. The nurses had watched in amazement as the notorious businessman sat cross-legged on the floor of Emma's room, playing with the dollhouse he'd brought her, his expensive suits replaced with jeans and sweaters. The legal proceedings had moved with unusual speed, partly because of Kane's resources, but mostly because Emma's case was heartbreakingly clear. Her biological mother had died of an overdose when Emma was 4. She'd bounced through 3 foster homes in 3 years, each one worse than the last. The final home, where the abuse had been most severe, had 16 children crammed into a 4-bedroom house. Emma had run away on a freezing November night after her foster father had beaten her with a belt for taking an extra piece of bread at dinner. She'd survived on the streets for 73 days before collapsing in that alley. Now, as they walked toward the exit, Emma wore a new pink dress with white flowers that she'd picked out herself during a shopping trip with Kane and a social worker. Her hair was clean and shining, pulled back with a butterfly clip. The bruises had faded to yellow shadows, and the cuts on her feet had healed. But more than her physical recovery, it was the light in her eyes that struck everyone who saw her, a spark of hope that had been extinguished and was now cautiously flickering back to life. Nurse Jennifer appeared in the hallway, her eyes glistening. "Emma, sweetheart, we're going to miss you so much." She knelt down and pulled the little girl into a hug. Over the past 2 weeks, The entire staff had fallen in love with this brave child who said, "Thank you," every time someone brought her medication and apologized whenever she needed anything. "I'll miss you too," Emma said softly. "But Alexander says I can come visit and bring cookies. He says we're going to learn to bake together." "He did he?" Jennifer smiled up at Kane, who had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. "I thought it would be a good skill for both of us to learn," Kane said, his hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder. "Plus, I promised I'd bring some to the nurse's station. Consider it a small down payment on the enormous debt I owe all of you." Tom Rodriguez emerged from the medication room, followed by Dr. Chun and several other staff members who'd been caring for Emma. It seemed half the hospital had found reasons to be in this particular corridor at this particular time. There were smiles and waves, a few tears, and a balloon bouquet that mysteriously appeared from somewhere. As they reached the main entrance, Kane paused and turned back to the assembled crowd. For a moment, the old commanding presence returned, but it was softer now, tempered by something that looked like humility. "I want you all to know," he said, his voice carrying through the corridor, "that the donation to the hospital isn't charity. It's not even really about money. It's about recognizing that you're all doing something I forgot how to do. You're showing up for people who have nothing and no one. You're fighting battles that don't make financial sense, saving lives that society has written off as too expensive or too complicated." He paused, his throat working. "You saved more than Emma's life that night. You saved mine too. Thank you." The elevator doors opened, and Maria Gonzalez stepped out. She'd been rehired as part of Kane's donation agreement, promoted to head of patient advocacy. Her eyes met Kane's, and for a moment, the corridor was silent. Then she walked forward and embraced him, whispering something no one else could hear. When she pulled back, Kane's eyes were wet, but he was smiling. Emma tugged on Kane's hand. "Alexander, can Miss Maria come to our house for dinner sometime? You said we're having lots of dinners now, with friends." "We are," Kane confirmed, looking at Maria hopefully. "And I would be honored if you'd join us." Maria nodded, unable to speak, and kissed Emma's forehead. Outside, a black car waited, but it wasn't the usual corporate sedan. Kane had bought a family SUV, complete with a booster seat carefully installed in the back. As he buckled Emma in, she clutched her stuffed rabbit, the same torn toy from the alley, now carefully repaired and cleaned by Kane's own hands. Sarah stood at the entrance doors, watching as the car pulled away. Emma's small hand pressed against the window, waving enthusiastically until they turned the corner and disappeared from view. Behind her, Jennifer sighed. "Do you think they'll really be okay?" Sarah thought about the broken man who'd crashed through those doors 2 weeks ago, and the scared little girl who'd been more dead than alive. She thought about second chances and the strange ways life brought people together. "Yes," she said finally. "I think they're going to be just fine." If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another powerful video. Thanks for watching.